Hi and welcome to this video. In this video, I am going to talk about the Human Rights and Surveillance Assessment Toolkit and explain it to you in a video format in an easy to understand manner. This toolkit provides two tests, one for analyzing a specific surveillance case against international human rights standards, and the other is to analyze a country's overall surveillance laws and legal framework and see whether it meets international human rights standards or not. First, a disclaimer, I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. It is meant for informational purposes only. This toolkit is based on Privacy International's Guide to International Law on Surveillance. This is a simplified at-a-glance assessment. It is not meant to be a legal test. It is only meant to give you a rough idea whether a particular case or a country fails to meet international human rights standards or not in regards to surveillance. First, the case assessment test. We need to ask a few preliminary questions. Does the surveillance interfere with the right to privacy or related rights such as freedom of expression, association, assembly, etc., or things such as legal privilege, medical privilege, and so on? If the answer is yes, then we move on to the next step. If the answer is no, then this is outside the scope of this test. First is the principle of legality. The threshold here is that is the surveillance prescribed by law or not? Accessibility. The first question we need to ask here is that is the law publicly available or not? Next, we need to ask about the foreseeability. Is the law clear enough for people to understand when and how the law may be used against them? If both of these questions fail, then this is a human rights violation. If both pass, then we move on to the next principle. The next principle here is the principle of necessity. The threshold here is that is the surveillance strictly necessary for a legitimate aim that is necessary in a democratic society or not? First, we need to ask about the legitimate aim. Is the aim clearly defined and legitimate? Example, national security or a serious crime, and so on. Next, we need to ask about no other options. Has the government shown that less intrusive options were not available? If both these questions fail, then this is the human rights violation. If both pass, we move on to the next principle. The next principle is the principle of proportionality. The threshold here is that is the surveillance proportionate to its aim? First, we need to ask about the harm versus benefit. Are harms to privacy outweighed by the legitimate benefits of surveillance? Next, we need to ask about the scope. Is surveillance targeted with a clear subject, scope, and time frame? We next need to ask about the limitedness. Is intrusion limited to what is strictly needed? Then we need to ask about the gravity. Is the intrusiveness and privacy harm done through surveillance proportionate to the gravity of the offense or the situation? If all four passes, then we move on to the next stage. But if any of these do not pass, if any of these fail, then this is a human rights violation. Principle 4, adequate safeguards. The threshold here is that were safeguards in place to prevent abuse. First, we talk about reasonable suspicion. Was there any factual basis for targeting? Next, we need to ask about judicial authorization. Was it approved by a judge or independent body? Next, we need to ask about oversight. Is there an independent body with access to classified information and the power to review? We then ask about data protection. Are collection, retention, and deletion of the surveillance related data regulated? Transparency. Are statistics published? Are people notified when secrecy is no longer necessary? Intelligence sharing. Are data transfers and foreign cooperation regulated? Metadata. Is metadata also protected like content data? Remedy or access to remedy. Can victims challenge surveillance and offenders be prosecuted in a court? Private foreign interference. Are companies and foreign actors also regulated in the same way? Impact assessments. Are human rights impact reviews done before a surveillance method is deployed for the first time? So, in summary, if all these principles pass in an individual case, that means that no human rights violations has taken place. But if one or more of these principles fail, then that means that according to international human rights standards, there has been a human rights violation in this particular case that you are assessing. Now we talk about the framework assessment test. This is a tool to assess a country's surveillance laws and frameworks against international human rights standards. First is the principle of legality. Here the threshold is that are powers clearly defined in accessible laws or not? We need to ask here, are all surveillance laws and regulations public? Are there any secret or unpublished rules or laws that are used? Do laws explain who can be targeted, under what conditions, and with what limits? Can individuals reasonably predict when surveillance may apply to them? If the laws are secret or vague, then this fails the legality test. Next is the principle of necessity. The threshold here is that is surveillance limited to legitimate and pressing aims necessary in a democratic society or not? We need to ask here, are powers restricted to serious crime or national security? Must authorities prove that less intrusive options were not available? If the answer to these questions is no, then this violates the necessity principle. Next, we move on to the principle of proportionality. The threshold here is that are powers of surveillance limited by proportionality rules? We need to ask here that whether privacy harms must be outweighed by legitimate benefits or not. Is surveillance that is allowed, is it targeted or is it general surveillance? Are there limits on the scope, duration and retention policies that is in place in regards to surveillance? Are bulk or mass surveillance measures banned or strictly controlled? If the surveillance is broad or untargeted, or it does not meet the proportionality questions that we have asked here, then this is a violation. Now we move on to the principle 4 of adequate safeguards. The threshold here is that are safeguards in place to prevent abuse or not? Reasonable suspicion. Are there objective grounds that is required before surveillance can be allowed? Judicial authorization. Is a prior court or independent approval needed before surveillance can be conducted or not? Oversight. Are there independent review bodies that has the ability to review surveillance and issue binding orders? Data protection. Are there clear rules on how surveillance related data is handled? Transparency. Is there any notification duty to victims and also public reports that has to be published? Intelligence sharing. Is there oversight of cross-border data flow? Metadata. Is there equal protection of content data as there is protection of the metadata? Remedy. Are there access to courts and can offenders be prosecuted? Third-party control. Are companies and foreign entities also regulated? Impact assessment. Is human rights review done before a new surveillance power or surveillance modality is deployed? If there is no remedy, no oversight and no accountability, then this is a grave violation. Next, we talk about the safeguarding civic space. If these protections are missing, then the framework severely violates international human rights standards. Number 1 is lawyer-client confidentiality. Number 2 is journalist source protection. Number 3 is safety of human rights defenders. Number 4 is freedom of public gatherings from surveillance. If these are absent, then there is a grave violation. Broader human rights obligations. We need to ask, are foreigners and people outside the country also protected? Is there any discrimination in targeting, or is discrimination in targeting prohibited? Discrimination here refers to the discrimination based on race, religion, gender, beliefs and so on. Failure to ensure this results in a serious breach. Online release of surveillance related data. The threshold here is that does the law prohibit and punish online leaks? We need to ask here, is disclosure banned unless lawful and necessary? Are leaks criminalized or not? Are there measures to prevent harassment and retaliation? Are officials accountable or not? Do victims have remedies and protection? Failure here means grave human rights violation. Mass surveillance. Are bulk and untargeted surveillance allowed or not? Is mass surveillance legally limited and independently overseen? If not, then this is a grave violation. Emerging technologies. We need to ask here if laws protect against encryption backdoors, unregulated hacking or spyware, abuse of biometric data. Lack of rules means high risk of violations. Role of companies. We need to ask here, are surveillance vendors licensed and controlled? Are corporate actors bound by human rights obligations or not? Is unregulated corporate surveillance happening or not? In conclusion, if all the principles and the other things that we have discussed, if all these are compliant, then we can say that a country's surveillance framework is in line with international human rights standards. If some gaps exist but can be corrected, then we say that it's partially in compliance. If key safeguards are missing, if there is unchecked power, if the principles fail, then these are clearly a concerning situation. And if there are secret laws, mass surveillance, and no oversight or remedy available, civic space is targeted, or there are discriminatory practices, then this means there is a clear and grave human rights situation in regards to digital and privacy rights. So now I hope that you will be able to easily assess a particular case or a particular country's framework in regards to surveillance and compare it with international human rights standards very easily from now on. So now you really know how to figure out if there is a human rights violation or not, and you can read the full toolkit and find it in the link in the description below. And I thank you for watching.